Hello and welcome to Written Words, and today we're going to be talking about paragraphs, perfect paragraphs. We're going to look at what paragraphs are and why we need them. We're going to look at how to write in paragraphs, and we're going to look at an example of paragraphs in classic literature. Paragraphs are an important part of writing because they add structure to a text. If a reader is faced with a single huge block of text that hasn't been organised into paragraphs, it can be off-putting to read and difficult to understand. At the other end of the scale, it can be just as confusing if the text is broken up at the end of every single line, because there's no visible structure, so it makes it difficult for the reader to navigate the text. It makes it difficult to differentiate between the various themes in the text. So what is a paragraph? A paragraph is a collection of sentences on the same theme, and that theme could be a person, a place, a time, or a topic. And when the theme changes, a new paragraph is needed. So, for example, if you're writing a scene set in a restaurant, the paragraphs might be set out like this. In paragraph 1, 2 characters enter the restaurant and look around. In paragraph 2, they sit at a table and order from the menu. In paragraph 3, they talk to each other as they wait for their food. And in paragraph 4, the food arrives and they start eating. The paragraphs break the scene down into smaller stages, and each stage has a new focus. If you imagine the same scene being shot for cinema, each one might be shot from a different camera angle. So each paragraph is like a separate camera angle. In essay writing, it's a good idea to start a new paragraph for each argument, using the paragraph to state the argument itself and explain the reasoning behind it, as well as giving examples. Similarly, in any other piece of informative writing, paragraphs can be divided according to each separate point, such as newspaper writing or non-fiction book writing or article writing. I've heard a lot of people asking what is the ideal length of a paragraph, and there is no fixed rule about length. But the longer it is, the higher the risk of losing the reader. Although consistently short paragraphs could also be seen as lacking depth. So you're looking for something somewhere in the middle, not too long, not too short, something in the middle. Some textbooks recommend approximately 3 to 5 sentences, or somewhere in the region of about 150 words. But it really is a matter of developing a sense of what feels right. If every paragraph is exactly the same length, then you start to restrict your writing, and the writing could suffer as a result of that. So you need to develop a sense of what feels right. And reading a lot and paying attention to paragraph structure can help you with this. The more you're aware of how paragraphs are written in other people's writing will help you develop a sense of what works best in your writing. It's also worth noting that paragraph length can vary depending on genre and style. Our extract for this lesson is taken from this particularly beautiful book, Jane Eyre by Charlotte Brontë. This particular copy is a very special one to me. It's been in my family a very long time, and it's actually dated 1896. So let's have a look at what Charlotte Brontë does with paragraphs. The section that we're going to take a look at comes from the beginning of chapter 3. The next thing I remember is waking up with a feeling as if I had had a frightful nightmare and seeing before me a terrible red glare crossed with thick black bars. I heard voices too, speaking with a hollow sound, and as if muffled by a rush of wind or water, agitation, uncertainty, and an all-predominating sense of terror confused my faculties. Ere long, I became aware that someone was handling me, lifting me up and supporting me in a sitting posture, and that more tenderly than I had ever been raised or upheld before. I raised my head against a pillow or an arm and felt easy. In 5 minutes more, the cloud of bewilderment dissolved. I knew quite well that I was in my own bed, and that the red glare was the nursery fire. It was night. A candle burnt on the table. Bessie stood at the bed foot with a basin in her hand, and a gentleman sat in a chair near my pillow, leaning over me. I felt an inexpressible relief, a soothing conviction of protection and security, when I knew that there was a stranger in the room, an individual not belonging to Gateshead and not related to Mrs. Reed. Turning from Bessie, though her presence was far less obnoxious to me than that of Abbott, for instance, would have been, I scrutinised the face of the gentleman. I knew him. It was Mr. Lloyd, an apothecary, sometimes called in by Mrs. Reed when the servants were ailing. For herself and the children she employed a physician. Before we delve more deeply into the paragraphs themselves, let's just have a look at how this text would look if it wasn't divided into paragraphs. It would be one single block of text, which looks slightly more off-putting than the version that we've just read, where it is divided into paragraphs. And now let's see what it would look like if it was broken up at the end of every single sentence, with every single sentence starting on a new line. This becomes very cumbersome, so much so that it wouldn't even fit on one slide. So if this was done for the whole book, which is already a considerable length, you would end up with a volume that was so unwieldy, it would be hard to hold, it would be hard to transport, and you would be forever turning the pages. So the way that paragraphs are set out is a perfect balance between the single block of text and dividing it up so much that it becomes essentially a long list of bullet points. So in this particular version, how have the paragraphs been formatted? If we look at the first line of each paragraph, there is an indent. The first line of each paragraph starts slightly further inward than the rest of the lines in the paragraph. Now let's look more closely at the 3 paragraphs that we have here and why they are arranged in the way they are. The first paragraph begins, "The next thing I remember is waking up with a feeling as if I had a frightful nightmare." And it goes on to explain what the person who is speaking sees as they wake up. It's about the moment in which that person opens their eyes and everything is slightly blurred and they're trying to focus, trying to make sense of what is going on around them. The second paragraph begins with the words, "in 5 minutes more." So between the first paragraph and the second paragraph, 5 minutes have passed. So that gives us a clue that there is a new focus here. And by this time, some of the blurriness has cleared, so the person can now see more of what's going on. They can identify people and objects. They can identify the bed, and the red glare is now clearly the nursery fire. And there are 2 people in the room who are clearly discernible. And then the third paragraph moves from describing what is physically in the room to describing how that person feels. I felt an inexpressible relief and a soothing conviction of protection and security. And then they go on to explain why they feel relieved and protected and secure. Because the people in the room are people who that person feels safe with. And we're also given a little explanation as to why that is. So that's a little glimpse of how Charlotte Brontë might organise her paragraphs in her work. Now take a look at any book that you have to hand, whether it's an old book or a modern book, fiction or non-fiction, as long as it contains a large amount of writing. Open the book at a random page and have a look at how the writer has arranged their paragraphs. Can you identify the themes of each paragraph and why the paragraph has changed when it has? Have a look at how long the paragraphs are. How many sentences in each paragraph? Are they all a similar length or do they vary? And what do you think of this? Do you think that's too long, too short, or just right? Now for our language focus, let's just recap how paragraphs should be set out. Because paragraphs contain different ideas, it makes sense to present them separately on the page. The most important thing is that they should be easy to spot, introducing a slight pause to the flow of the text so that we know when to expect a new idea, but without interrupting the flow of the text too much. To do this, each new paragraph must begin on a new line. In order to make the paragraph clearer, the first line of that paragraph could be indented. The first line begins slightly further in than the rest of the text. Or a space could be left between the paragraphs, but not too big. Word processing software is often set to do this automatically as a default whenever you press the return key, so you don't have to remember it each time. If you have a copy of the worksheet for this lesson, take a closer look at it and identify how the paragraphs have been separated on there. Alternatively, take a book from your bookshelf and have a look at how the paragraphs have been separated in there too. There are slight variations in style depending on style manuals and people's preferences, whether that involves indenting, spacing, or a mixture of both. But it's important to have something just to flag up that a new paragraph is happening. And now for our writing prompt. For this exercise, you'll need to go back to earlier in the lesson where I outlined a scene in a restaurant, and we broke that scene down into 4 separate paragraphs. If you have a copy of the worksheet, it's also set down on there. And now have a go at writing that scene for yourself, adding as much information and interest as you can, whilst keeping to the outline of the paragraphs and being careful to set out your paragraphs in the correct way. Don't forget to take a look at the worksheet for this lesson, which can be downloaded from our website at writtenwords.uk. The worksheet contains everything we've discussed in this lesson, with a few extra bits as well. Thank you very much for joining me in this lesson. I look forward to seeing you in the next one. And in the meantime, happy writing.